everyone. My name is Lindsay, and as a child, my parents told me that I was special. 6 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with idiopathic sudden sensorineural hearing loss, a condition that affects approximately 5 to 20 people in every 100,000. This means that I'm 1 in 20,000. It started on September 11th when I was hiking with a group of friends in Marin. I heard a pop in my left ear, which was followed by some unpleasant pressure and a ringing that's persisted for the last 6 weeks. Thinking this was a simple sinus problem, I went home and I started taking Claritin D. I hoped that the pseudoephedrine, a decongestant, would help clear my sinuses. The next day, there was no change in my status, so I called my doctor, who wrote me a prescription for Veramist, which is a corticosteroid nasal spray. Now, not convinced that a nasal spray was going to be helpful to my ear, and continuing to be worried, I tweeted the next day, "On Sunday, I lost hearing in my left ear. When I place a landline phone next to my ear, I can't even hear the dial tone. Help." My curious and worried Googling suggested that I had sudden hearing loss, a condition which was described by Medscape as being an autologic emergency. I knew that I needed to get help, so I turned to Google, who helped me find the nearest ENT, or ear, nose, and throat physician, in Menlo Park, where I work. This led me to Dr. Paul Yoon at Menlo Medical Clinic, which is associated with Stanford Hospitals and Clinics. Now, by day, I work at a Silicon Valley venture capital firm called Canaan Partners, and I've recently been dabbling in the Health 2.0 movement. So I knew that there was probably an app that could help me quantify how severe my hearing loss was. I found a free app called SoundCheck, and it was no surprise to me when the results showed that my right ear was normal and that I had severe hearing loss in my left ear. Sudden sensorineural hearing loss is defined from a textbook definition as something that occurs in less than 3 days in 3 continuous frequencies at a decibel of greater than 30. Now, I knew in my case that the onset had been within 48 hours, so I satisfied the first criteria. And with the help of my iPhone hearing test, I saw that in my left ear, my hearing loss was at 3 continuous frequencies. So the remaining question was the extent of my hearing loss greater than 30 decibels? At this point, you might be scratching your head and asking yourself, what causes sudden hearing loss? Well, as it turns out, approximately 80 to 90% of cases are idiopathic or unknown. For those that can be traced to a specific etiology, the cause is often an infectious disease, a circulatory, or a neurological problem. Other causes include ototoxic drugs. How is this diagnosed? Well, first of all, hearing tests, but secondarily, blood tests to rule out infectious diseases, and MRI to rule out circulatory and neuro problems. First-line treatment for sudden sensorineural hearing loss is oral prednisone, followed by intratympanic or steroid injections. The same day that I saw Dr. Yoon, I had my first hearing test. This is a faxed result, and this complicated mess shows that my middle ear function was actually okay, but from the very lowest to the very highest frequencies, I had profound sensorineural hearing loss with no speech recognition, meaning that I could hear nothing in my left ear, no autoacoustic emissions, and poor hair cell function. What surprised me the most about the results of the audiogram were that this $375 test, which took 45 minutes, produced the same results as the free iPhone test that took me 3 minutes while I was laying in bed. I had a normal MRI, and I celebrated with my friends and family on Facebook by posting the images to Facebook in an album I called My Beautiful Brain. Note, images taken inside my cranium. The next day, I started taking high-dose prednisone therapy. I was worried about things like weight gain, elevated blood pressure, elevated blood glucose, difficulty sleeping, and mood change. Every morning with breakfast, I took 3 20-milligram tablets. One of the things that helped keep me going through this difficult and challenging time was tracking some of my data. Here are a couple of screenshots from my iPhone test taken on September 13th. I call this baseline data, and because this was taken 2 days after the onset of my first symptoms. Now watch carefully about what happens to these blue bars and these blue dots just 4 days after my first dose. This was encouraging to me, and it didn't come as any surprise when after 16 days, my hearing was practically back to normal, with the exception of some frequencies in the middle range. So what did this data provide? Well, for me, this data was hope. As a type A personality, this gave me a sense of ownership and control over my own treatment. It also helped me to better visualize my progress, and it was shareable information that I put on my blog and shared with family and friends. It also helped me increase my prescription compliance, because as I found that I was improving with steroids, I wanted to keep taking the steroids because they were working. There was a positive feedback loop that was created. And because I knew that the results were predictive, it also helped me predict the results of my weekly audiograms that I was doing with an audiologist. As you can see, my economics teacher would be proud that I saw that after the first week, I started to experience diminishing marginal returns. That is, the improvements after week 2 were still happening, but they were happening in smaller and smaller increments. So this data provided the decision support for my decision to start tapering off the high-dose therapy on October 3rd. And it also provided the basis for starting second-line therapy, which is intratympanic dexamethasone. Now, I was aware that second-line therapy only had a 50% chance of being successful. And on October 13th, I had my first injection. Crossed my fingers and waited.
1 minute.
This shows that on one day before the first injection and 10 days after, there was no statistically significant change, unfortunately. I had my second injection today, and as I think about the last 6 weeks, I think about all of the doctor's appointments, the audiograms, the trips to the pharmacy, the blood work, the MRI, and I started to think about the time and the associated cost of doing all of this doctoring. And my rough economic estimate is that the last 6 weeks have cost me over $12,000. Now, fortunately, I have great insurance, but even if you add on the 50 hours that I've spent doing all of this, the total skyrockets to over $15,000. This contrasts, interestingly enough, with a self-tracking approach, where I could have been monitoring my own progress with an iPhone, taking prednisone, which costs cents on the dollar, and even if you factor in the lost productivity of picking up my prescription, $120, which is less than 1/1000% of conventional medicine.
Wow.
So what have I learned? Well, in my case, data equals hope, data equals decision support, and lastly, self-tracking could be a potential way to cut future healthcare costs from the system. Thank you.
Wow.
What a great talk. For those who haven't been at a QS before, our tradition is we just have a short question and answer, and I usually just moderate that. So raise your hand and I'll call on you. Mark.
Hi. Thank you, Lindsay. It was great. I recently got insurance. I probably never had insurance in my life before, and the doctors went nuts. Hey, let's do this. Let's do that. Let's do this. Let's do that. And I was amazed that there's like $30,000 or $40,000 worth of tests that have been done, and I'm looking at your differences and costs, and I'm wondering, oh my God, could you risk that difference? I mean, could you go
risk
without
in what
these
sense, Mark?
tests?
Risk in the sense that she might be missing something that she really wants to know? Yeah, that's a good question. Would you be afraid to do this without the calibration of the official medical test?
So of course this is all in hindsight, but as I think about it, I think about, MRI was used to rule out things which are very, very rare. Acoustic neuroma, maybe 1 out of every 500 cases. Blood work, sure, I could have had something wrong, but actually in the grand scheme of things, blood work is not what was driving up the cost. When I come down here and I see what the biggest cost driver was, it's these steroid injections, which actually haven't done anything. And what was most efficacious for me was taking $36 of prednisone, and maybe would have just required a simple 1 trip to the doctor to get a prescription for. And with something like hearing loss, I know how I'm doing. I can tell if I'm getting better because I can hear it. And I'm not certain that, you know, all of these repeat testing and everything else that they've done for me has actually been value add.
Maybe the way to ask the question is, what would it take to persuade you the next time you get ill just to rely on an iPhone app and not go to the doctors? What would it take for you to feel comfortable just relying on a self-quantification?
It would have to be a health experience that I had previously, maybe something like a common cold or a sore throat. For me, hearing loss was terribly frightening. I'm 25 years old, and 25-year-olds are not supposed to go hiking and go deaf in 2 days. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it, but I realized in the process that oftentimes you can't trace this to any specific thing. And so in this relatively rare instance, going through the testing provided that reassurance. And for me to say, no, don't do this to me in the future, it would have to be for something which I had a familiarity with.
Paul, would you just tell us when it's 8:05 and we'll knock off then?
Okay.
Avi, I know you had a question.
Right. I think that having looked at patterns, many different types of patterns, you can't expect a patient to take a rare and unusual disorder and make that decision. But when you look at the patterning here, this, along with hundreds of other conditions, are all treated the same. They're treated with steroids and then a bunch of tests because there's no fundamental intelligence built in, so there's no data on what is the potential etiology. So we have some rarities that we look for and rule out and do with expensive imaging technology, because that's all we have. So you can't take that decision onto yourself because you cannot afford to miss certain things. And you have to then go into a system that isn't as intelligent as it is. And so the main message for me to the group is quantitate, because you're becoming more intelligent than the system, because the system lacks fundamental understanding of these rare, undiagnosable conditions, which are no longer rare. They're growing and growing and growing in number.
Okay, so let me ask one thing that I'm curious about, which is, did you encounter any other person, not like a reference source, but a person who had this condition and had been through what you had been through?
So I was all over Twitter. I signed up for Patients Like Me. I was posting to my blog, and someone, I don't know where he was, found one of my blog posts probably through a Google alert because I had tagged it for sudden sensory neural hearing loss, and he contacted me and said, hey, this happened to me too. I'm about 4 weeks ahead of you. You know, your case sounds exactly like mine. Keep your head up. Good luck.
Right. I mean, it strikes me that in 1 out of 20,000 is rare, but at a population level, there might be knowledge sharing possibilities, and I'm just curious. I mean, you're still involved in this, right? Like,
right.
You're not at the end of this.
Right.
Are you thinking about how to kind of both share your knowledge and benefit maybe from some knowledge that might be out there that could help you?
Well, this is a good first step. And certainly I think it's important to share, because especially for this condition, there's a real lack of randomized controlled trials and studies and data and information. So I think anecdotal evidence becomes extremely powerful, particularly for newly diagnosed patients who are just craving any sort of information they can get their hands on.
And I'll go to a question, but I want to just follow up with one thing. Is the prednisone diagnostic, in the sense that if you were doing this yourself, and you were wondering, well, is it a brain tumor or something? If you took the prednisone and it improved your hearing, would that be satisfactory, in a sense, instead of an MRI, right? Because the prednisone shouldn't necessarily improve.
So interesting point is that the American Academy of Otolaryngology met in San Francisco in September, and actually their new guidelines call for MRI as being standard of care in cases of sudden sensory neural hearing loss. So the tides may be changing.
So, Chris.
That was a great talk, thanks. I would just
I would look at it a little differently, not like either or, doctor or tracking. You know, doctor plus tracking, could it have reduced any of the 9 doctor visits or 6 audiograms and lost productivity? Clearly, it seems it would have.
Right.
Agreed.
What did your doctor think of the data you'd collected yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So I saw my doctor today when he shot some more steroids into my ear. Got another $2,500 for doing that. And I told him that I was coming here tonight to give this talk, and he hadn't heard of Quantified Self, but I promised to maybe send him a video afterwards. And you know, because I'm under his ongoing care, hopefully we can have and create more of a dialogue around this.
How much do you charge to do my slides?
Okay, well, let's take a. I think we have time for a question or two more.
So, if you change your point of view to somebody who didn't have access to Western-style insurance and healthcare, and you are in an emerging market or somewhere where the primary care wasn't available to you, do you feel like you would be more comfortable experimenting and self-diagnosing with your theoretical, you know, the disruptive pattern as opposed to the traditional pattern? Because like if then you're put in a you know, evolutionary competition, you have to make a smart choice or you could have serious trouble. Do you think it would be easier to make that choice to self-administer or self-correct?
Ooh, that's very philosophical.
Because there are millions of people out there right now that can get access to the latter case, but not the first.
You know what? I think I'll take that as a good comment and just take another question. Since we have, let's take one more, all the way in the back.
What was the app that you used to track?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
What app?
What app did you use?
Oh, it's actually made by the hearing aid manufacturer Starkey, and it's very clever. If it detects that you have hearing loss, it'll put you in touch with a hearing professional that distributes their hearing aids. So you can just search, you know, hearing test, and it'll be, you know, one of the most highly ranked results.
Lindsay, thank you so much. What a great talk. And Thomas.